The last name on the list. There is a document most people have never read. It was not classified. It was not leaked. It was published openly in September 2000 by a group of men who would go on to run the most powerful government on earth, and buried inside its 90 pages was a sentence so precise, so coldly prophetic, that reading it today while bombs fall on Tehran feels less like history and more like a confession. They wrote that transforming American power would likely take a long time absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. They published that sentence 12 months before September 11, 2001. 12 months later, they had their Pearl Harbor. And 10 days after that, a Pentagon general pulled a piece of paper from his desk, closed his office door, and showed it to Wesley Clark, the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and said, quietly, "This is a memo describing how we are going to take out 7 countries in 5 years. 7 countries, 5 years. The last name on the list was Iran. That was 25 years ago. And today, on March 14, 2026, American bombs are falling on Iranian soil. Not because the plan changed, because it never did. Before we go any further, understand what kind of story this actually is. This is not a story about Donald Trump. It is not a story about nuclear weapons. It is not even at its core a story about the Middle East. It is a story about a plan written by specific men, in specific rooms, for specific reasons that has been executing itself across a quarter century with the slow, grinding patience of something that was never meant to be rushed. To understand where we are, you have to go back before the bombs, before Operation Epic Fury, before the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, before the 2015 nuclear deal or its deliberate unraveling. You have to go back to 1997 to a small Washington think tank called the Project for the New American Century, and to a founding statement of principles signed by names that should make your blood run cold in hindsight. Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, John Bolton. Not one of them held a senior government position at that moment. They were out of power, writing documents, building frameworks, waiting. Their founding statement called for American global leadership, military dominance, and what they described as a Reaganite policy of military strength and moral clarity. 3 years later, in that same September 2000 document, they were more specific. American forces abroad should serve as the cavalry on the new American frontier. America must maintain forward-based forces in the Middle East. Military control of the Gulf region was not optional, it was essential. And the single greatest long-term threat they identified? China developing closer to his 2 key oil-producing states, including Iran. Write that down. Hold on to it. We will come back to it. Then came September 11th, and everything accelerated. Wesley Clark has told this story publicly in a 2007 interview, in his memoir, in speeches at universities. He walked into the Pentagon 10 days after the attacks to visit old colleagues at the Joint Chiefs. A general he knew pulled him aside and showed him the memo. 7 countries in 5 years: Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing with Iran. Not one of those 7 countries had a proven operational connection to the September 11th attacks. Not one. The country that did have a direct connection, the country from which 15 of the 19 hijackers actually came, whose citizens had funded al-Qaeda, was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was not on the list. Saudi Arabia has never been on any list. That single fact dismantles the entire stated rationale more efficiently than any argument could. The plan was not about retribution. It was not about justice for the dead. It was about the map. It was about the oil. It was about what the NAC architects had been writing since 1997: American dominance over the most energy-rich region on Earth, and cutting off China's access to it before that access became strategic leverage. The attacks of September 11th did not create the plan. They unlocked it. What followed was the methodical execution of that plan, domino by domino, across 2.5 decades. Iraq fell first, March 2003, on the basis of weapons of mass destruction that did not exist and an al-Qaeda connection that had been fabricated. The invasion killed between 600,000 and 1 million Iraqi civilians. It cost the United States over $2 trillion and nearly 4,500 American lives. And it achieved something the plan's architects may not have fully calculated by removing Saddam Hussein, the one Arab leader who had effectively contained Iranian regional ambition. America handed Iran a strategic windfall. Iran filled the vacuum with astonishing speed, backing Shia militias, embedding itself in Iraqi politics, and extending its network of allied forces across Syria, Lebanon, and beyond. The second and third dominoes were Libya and Syria. Libya fell in 2011 when NATO air power helped rebels overthrow and kill Gaddafi, leaving behind a fractured state that has not achieved stable governance since. Syria took longer years of CIA and British intelligence support for rebel groups, a grinding civil war, but it fell in December 2024 when Assad's government finally collapsed and he fled to Moscow. The land bridge between Iran and its Hezbollah allies in Lebanon was severed. That severing was not incidental, it was load-bearing. Because the fourth domino was Hezbollah, and Hezbollah was the reason Iran had a credible deterrent against Israel in the first place. For decades, Hezbollah's missile arsenal in southern Lebanon was what kept Israeli military action against Iran off the table. Israel had attempted to reoccupy southern Lebanon in 2006 and been driven back in weeks. As long as Hezbollah remained capable, striking Iran meant absorbing a devastating counterattack from the north. So before Iran could be reached, Hezbollah had to be dismantled. In the autumn of 2024, it was, in the shadow of the Israel-Hamas war, Israel launched a systematic campaign against Hezbollah's leadership assassinations, precision strikes on weapons stores, decapitation of its command structure. By November 2024, the organization that had once bloodied the IDF was operating at a fraction of its former strength. The forward deterrent was gone. Somalia and Sudan, less central, but on the list, have faced decades of American military presence, drone operations, and proxy conflict. They were addressed, which left one name. The name that was always going to be last. The name circled in every version of every plan for 25 years. By February 2026, the architecture was complete. Iraq was in America's orbit. Syria's government was gone. Hezbollah was decimated. Lebanon was weakened. Libya was fragmented. Iran had been systematically stripped of every ally, every deterrent, every regional buffer it possessed, and its nuclear program had advanced to a threshold that provided the political pretext for the final move. What NAC had called a 5-year project had taken 25, but the board was finally set. On February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury began, nearly 900 strikes in the first 12 hours. The supreme leader killed in the opening wave, air defenses dismantled. The operation the neoconservatives had blueprinted in 1997, described to Wesley Clark in 2001, that Cheney had privately pushed. Throughout the Bush years, that Obama had deflected through the 2015 nuclear deal, that Trump had enabled by withdrawing from that deal in 2018, it had begun. Now here is the detail that needs to be said plainly because most coverage has buried it. 3 days before the bombs fell, Oman's foreign minister announced a diplomatic breakthrough. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium. Iran had agreed to full IAEA verification. Iran had agreed to irreversibly downgrade its uranium to the lowest possible level. New talks were scheduled for March 2nd. The United States launched its attack on February 28th. One day before those talks were set to produce a deal. The stated justification for the war, the nuclear program, was 24 hours from a diplomatic resolution. The bombs fell anyway. You have to ask yourself why, and the history of this plan gives you an answer that is deeply uncomfortable. Because if the war were genuinely about the nuclear program, you stop when the nuclear program is being handed over at the negotiating table. You do not stop when the last domino is one day from falling. The Center for Strategic and International Studies said something this week that deserves to be heard in full. They wrote that Operation Epic Fury is likely the start of a prolonged conflict, and that the United States and Israel have moved beyond targeting nuclear facilities and are now seeking to destroy the Iranian government entirely. Not constrain it, not denuclearize it, destroy it. That is the NAC agenda. That is the 2001 memo. That is regime change, the same regime change that was the plan's destination all along, now being openly acknowledged by one of Washington's most respected foreign policy institutions. And there is a nuclear proliferation dimension to this that the architects of the plan appear not to have fully reckoned with. Iran still possesses 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. The exact location of that material is uncertain. Iran's nuclear scientists have been scattered by the conflict, if the atomic energy organization of Iran collapses entirely, those scientists and that material could become available to actors whose intentions are far worse. America went to war to prevent nuclear proliferation. The war itself may be accelerating the exact risk it claimed to be stopping. And then there is China, and here the plan has failed in the most spectacular possible way. The NAC architects built their entire strategic framework around one central concern: preventing China from developing deep ties to key oil-producing states, particularly Iran, control the Gulf, control the energy, limit China's leverage. That was the logic. That was the reason the plan existed. Chinese flagged tankers are currently the only vessels moving freely through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran is offering to reopen the strait on one condition: that oil be traded in Chinese yuan, not American dollars. Russia is providing Iran with intelligence on American troop movements. China is buying Iranian crude, paying in yuan, deepening its economic partnership with the Islamic Republic, and watching the United States spend an estimated $1 billion a day in a war that is burning through its military resources, its political capital, and its global credibility. The plan designed to stop China from growing closer to Iran has produced a war that is driving Iran directly into China's arms. The strategic premise that justified 25 years of violence has collapsed in real time over the Gulf of Oman beneath a sky full of American bombers. But behind all of this, behind every domino, every strategic calculation, every memo and white paper and think tank publication, there were people. Over 600,000 Iraqi civilians killed, a Libya that has not known stable government in 14 years, hundreds of thousands of Syrian dead in a civil war that outside powers spent years actively fueling, Lebanese families who lost everything in the campaign against Hezbollah, and now in Iran more than 2,000. Dead in 15 days, 70 young girls killed in a school in Minab while strikes hit the Revolutionary Guard base next door. An internet blackout exceeding 260 hours, cutting 90 million people off from the outside world, 3.2 million displaced within their own borders, a 3rd century Sassanid castle that survived, the Mongol invasions and the Ottoman Empire damaged by American strikes. These were not acceptable losses in someone else's plan. These were human beings who lived inside the consequences of decisions made in Washington think tanks by men who had never set foot on Iranian soil, never learned a word of Farsi, and never had to look at the people their plan was always going to come for. Wesley Clark tried to warn us. He ran for president partly to stop this momentum from building. He gave speeches. He sat with journalists. He told anyone who would listen what the memo said and what executing it would cost. He was dismissed, called a conspiracy theorist, a disgruntled former general. Now, 22 years after he tried to sound the alarm, the bombs are falling on the 7th country on the list. Whether Operation Epic Fury produces the outcome its architects imagined: a safer world, a weakened Iran, a democratic future for the Iranian people, or whether it produces a prolonged conflict with no exit, a nuclear proliferation crisis, and a Gulf energy system that now flows through Beijing rather than Washington, those questions will be answered over the years ahead. But the question of whether this was planned, whether the nuclear justification was the real reason or a pretext used the same way weapons of mass destruction were used in 2003, whether the men executing this war today are the intellectual heirs of the men who wrote those documents in 1997 and 2001, that question has already been answered. The memo existed. The plan existed. Knack wrote it in plain English and published it. Wesley Clark told us about it on camera. The dominoes fell in order. And on March 14, 2026, the last name on the list is burning. This is not comfortable knowledge, but it is knowledge you needed. Understanding how we arrived here is not separate from figuring out where we go. Next, it is the only foundation from which that question can be honestly asked. Share this, because the next plan is already being written, and the people it will come for deserve to have someone paying attention this time.